I'm interested in the way that firms develop. Specifically, I look at the origin of firm differences and within a technological context. Now, the subject of why firms are different has received some attention in the literature, but traditionally people have sort of waved it away. The standard view in economics is to actually control for firm differences and then to look at apples to apples comparisons across firms. And that works within that context pretty well. Even within the traditional strategic frameworks, it is very normal to take a stock of the firm's strengths, weaknesses, capabilities, and then allow the firm to do an analysis of where it can fit into a competitive landscape. Now, all of that presumes that the firm's strengths and weaknesses are relatively fixed. And that has served us pretty well, in management. But what happens when the environment changes? If the activity that your firm is engaged in at any given moment is serving you well, and then there's a radical shift in the environment, the firm might find itself at a loss as to how to react to that. And so it turns out that we don't have a lot of very good frameworks to allow a firm to enact change and to consciously adapt to the new environment. We know that firms can sometimes change. We have observed that and documented it. But even more frequently, we see firms not being able to change and react and then thus flounder and fail. So for me, my interest is to try to understand firm evolution from the early stages so that we can see periods during which firms are changing and adapting, and then possibly glean some insights into how that can then be consciously applied by firms at maturity in order to deal with the environmental turbulence that they might be experiencing. Now, more specifically, what I do is that I look at a sample of about 1,200 firms around the time when they go public. My hypothesis is that this is a time of radical change for the firm, during which they're much more plastic than they would be otherwise, given the amount of things that are changing in terms of both the formal and the informal structures. So then what I do is I control for firms that went through the IPO as planned, versus a set of firms that experienced a shock that was unexpected around the time of going public. And then I compare to see whether that shock leads to divergent development afterwards. So what I'm trying to find is to see if I can pick up a case of more heightened plasticity in the firm as it's going through this IPO process. And then what I find is that, in fact, there's a very short window of about 18 months around the time when they go public where they're particularly susceptible to the environment. And thus, the conditions that they experience at that point seem to determine, even 20 years later, the type of firm that they are, their strengths, their weaknesses, in terms of their technological direction. Some of the key takeaways from the research are that we find that not only do firms develop tastes and preferences, but rather they seem to be actually developing what we would call capabilities. That is, the technological ability to do things differently. The firms that were exposed to, for example, non-conducive environments for acquisitions counterbalance that by developing stronger internal research capabilities. And so that suggests that what is driving this is not so much the top management's predilection or preferences for doing one thing versus another, but rather something that is ingrained at deeper levels of the organization in terms of what the people and the routines and the structures of the firm allow it to do. In my case, looking at research-intensive activities. And so that is valuable in allowing us to actually locate the locus of where the persistence of these temporary shocks ultimately resides in the long term. For businesses, my research might ultimately give them more insight into what they can change, what they cannot change, and how. Now, this is a big agenda, and for now I've barely scratched the surface by documenting that short periods of sensitivity can have lasting effect on what the firm can ultimately do. But for managers, even in the short term, it hints at perhaps the importance of being aware of when they're going through a transition, such as going public, and how that might have unintended effects in disrupting their prior plans. So the best laid business plan up to the IPO may not be what works best going forward, given, for example, an unexpected shock. So, for managers managing the transition from being a private firm to a public firm, this should inform at least the awareness to be much more conscious about what the environment was like at the time and how that may have inadvertently influenced decisions that seem trivial at the time, such as what type of people they're hiring and what sort of routines they're developing, but also might end up shifting the direction of the firm in ways that they had not anticipated. Now, stepping away from the IPO context, I think it's important to note that these things are actually, probably not limited to the IPO. There's other disruptive events. And I think that, some of these findings should generalize for managers to think about whether other disruptions, such as changes in management or mergers, can also be disruptive in also managing that transition. I think that my research suggests that it is important to look at the way that the environment is a hitherto, relatively ignored component of what is shaping the firm and how it affects the firm differently at different times. The choice of looking at IPOs is a convenient one from a data perspective in that looking at a very large sample, it provides a very clean before and after situation where we can pinpoint when change was happening. But theoretically, there's nothing to limit us to saying that the IPO is somehow privileged as a window. I mean, as I said, there might be mergers, acquisitions, death of founders, and all sorts of transformative events that might have a similar impact on the firm. So I'm extending my research by looking at different conditions that might also precipitate these periods of heightened plasticity in the firm. Moving beyond just these sort of temporal effects, I'm also looking at digging deeper into what precisely is going within the firm. So whereas my studies so far have looked at large sample firms and statistical data that hints at what's really going on, to get a much more tangible feel for that requires getting into a smaller set of firms or going deeper and looking at actually interviews and more case-grounded type of approach to really provide much more tangible evidence that like I said, whether the change is being perpetuated through formal or informal routines or formal or informal relationships, or whether it's at the top or at the bottom of the organization.